The shadow in the basement. It was a bright summer morning when the Johnson family moved into their new home. The house was old, with creaky floors and faded wallpaper, but it had a charm that the family found appealing. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson had spent months looking for the perfect house, and this one felt like it could finally be home. Their two children, Emma and Jack, were excited about having their own rooms and a big yard to play in. The house had one feature that stood out, a large basement. Mr. Johnson saw it as a perfect storage area, while Mrs. Johnson thought it could be a cozy space for a family room. Emma and Jack, however, felt uneasy about the basement from the start. It was dark and cold with a musty smell that made them wrinkle their noses, but their parents reassured them, saying it just needed a good cleaning and some light. Sometimes Emma Jackson let out when she was asleep to listen to a customer, and occasionally she ran around her house like she was a cat. The first few days in the house were filled with unpacking and settling in. Everyone was busy arranging furniture, hanging pictures, and making the house feel like home. At night, the family would sit together in the living room, laughing and planning their future in the new place. Everything seemed normal at first. However, things began to change. It started with small noises. Late at night, when the house was quiet, they would hear faint sounds coming from the basement. It was as if someone was shuffling around down there. Mr. Johnson brushed it off, saying it was probably just the old house settling or the wind blowing through cracks. But the noises continued, and they seemed to grow louder each night. Mr. Johnson once brought the house up for settling, but the wind blew through the cracks, and they were heard almost every third night. One evening, as Mrs. Johnson was folding laundry, she heard a thud coming from the basement. She froze, her heart racing. Gathering her courage, she went to the basement door and called out, "Is anyone there?" There was no reply. She slowly opened the door and peered down the stairs. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, and the air felt colder than usual. Deciding it was nothing, she closed the door and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Emma and Jack also started noticing strange things. Emma, who loved drawing, had a habit of leaving her sketchbook in the living room. One morning she found it in the basement. "Mom, did you move my sketchbook?" she asked. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "Maybe you left it there and forgot," she suggested. But Emma was sure she hadn't. Jack, on the other hand, began having nightmares. He would wake up crying, saying he saw shadows moving in his room. "It's just a bad dream," his parents said, trying to comfort him. But Jack was adamant. "The shadow comes from the basement," he whispered one night, his voice trembling. He was moving around the house one night, stopped short. He said the shadow was alive and waiting for him. "The shadow comes from the basement," he whispered one night. The family's dog Max also acted strangely. Max had always been a playful and friendly dog, but now he refused to go near the basement. He would stand at the top of the stairs, growling softly, his ears pinned back. No amount of coaxing could get him to go down. As the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Objects would go missing and turn up in odd places. Doors would creak open on their own. Cold drafts would sweep through the house, even when all the windows were closed. The family began to feel like they were being watched, especially when they were near the basement. One night, Mr. Johnson decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement, determined to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. The stairs creaked under his weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, he shone the flashlight around the room. It was just as he remembered, dusty boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs in the corners. But as he turned to leave, he thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. He spun around, but there was nothing there. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, climbing back up the stairs. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The turning point came one stormy night. The family was gathered in the living room watching a movie. When the power went out, the house was plunged into darkness, and the sound of thunder echoed through the walls. Mrs. Johnson lit some candles, and they decided to wait out the storm. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the basement. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Emma whispered, clutching Jack's hand. Mr. Johnson grabbed a flashlight and said, "Stay here. I'll check it out." "Be careful," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice shaking. He opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same dusty room, but this time, something was different. One of the old boxes had fallen over, and its contents were scattered across the floor. As he bent down to pick them up, he noticed something strange. Beneath the box was a trap door, hidden under a layer of dirt and debris. Mr. Johnson called for his wife, and together they examined the trap door. It was small and had a rusty handle. With some effort, they managed to pull it open. A narrow, dark tunnel stretched out before them, disappearing into the shadows. Still holding on to each other, neither one spoke of the traumatic event that had occurred. Stuck together as a family, they stretched out arms like, "What is this?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Mr. Johnson replied, "but we need to find out." They decided to wait until morning to explore the tunnel. That night, none of them could sleep. They kept the lights on and stayed together in the living room, too afraid to be alone. When they were completely comfortable, they tossed the girl's pillow out of the way and lay down, so they weren't frightened when they heard the roar of a tunnel as 4 rifle bullets fired. "What the hell is that?" The next day, armed with flashlights and a sense of determination, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson ventured into the tunnel. The walls were damp, and the air was thick with an earthy smell. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until they finally reached the end. What they found there made their blood run cold. It was a small room, lined with stone walls. In the center was an old wooden chair, surrounded by strange symbols drawn on the floor. On the walls were faded photographs and newspaper clippings, all of them showing the same man. The headline spoke of disappearances and unsolved mysteries. "This is horrifying," Mrs. Johnson said, clutching her husband's arm. They took photos of the room and returned to the house, shaken by what they had seen. Over the next few days, they researched the house's history and discovered a chilling truth. Decades ago, a man had lived there who was suspected of abducting people. The police had searched the house but found no evidence, and the case went cold. The man eventually disappeared, and the house changed hands many times over the years. Realizing the danger they might be in, the Johnsons decided to leave the house. They packed their belongings and moved out as quickly as possible. Before leaving, they reported their findings to the authorities, who launched a full investigation. The tunnel and the room were sealed off, and the house was left vacant once again. When the house was left vacant once again, the Johnson family never forgot their time in the old house. It was an experience that left them shaken, but also brought them closer together. They learned to trust their instincts and to never ignore the strange and unexplainable. And though they moved on to a new home, they would always remember the shadow in the basement. The Missing Hiker by T. It was a cool autumn morning when a group of friends decided to go on a hike. They had been talking about exploring the nearby mountain trail for weeks. The forest around the mountain was known for its beauty, with tall trees, colorful leaves, and winding paths. People often said it was like walking into another world. But there were also stories about strange things happening in those woods. The group brushed off the tales as silly rumors and focused on the excitement of their adventure. Their group discussed the composition of their dream playground, filled with wild Hollywood and trees, and focused on the excitement of their adventure. The group of 5 friends included Emma, Jack, Lily, Sam, and Mia. They packed their bags with snacks, water, flashlights, and a map of the trail. Jack, the most adventurous of the group, led the way. He had been on a few hikes before and was confident they would have no trouble finding their way. Mia, on the other hand, was a bit nervous. She had heard some of the creepy stories about the mountain but didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. As they started the hike, everything seemed perfect. The sun was shining, the air was fresh, and the trees around them glowed with shades of red, orange, and yellow. They laughed and talked, taking pictures of the beautiful scenery. Every so often, they stopped to admire the view or take a sip of water. The trail seemed easy enough, and they felt like they had nothing to worry about. After a couple of hours, they came across a strange-looking tree. It was much older and larger than the other trees around it, with twisted roots that stuck out of the ground like claws. The bark was dark and rough, almost as if it had been burned. "That tree looks kind of creepy," Lily said with a nervous laugh. The others agreed but didn't think much of it. They snapped a picture of the tree and kept walking. Lily went back to the park and spoke to the man on the street. They returned to the broken tree and kept walking. As they moved further along the trail, things began to feel a little different. The air grew colder, even though the sun was still shining. The forest seemed quieter, and the cheerful sound of birds chirping was replaced by an eerie silence. "Does it feel weird to anyone else?" Mia asked. The others shrugged it off, saying it was just the natural stillness of the forest. Jack joked, "Maybe the forest knows we're here and wants to scare us." Everyone laughed, but Mia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. A little while later, they reached a small clearing. In the middle of it was an old wooden sign with faded writing. It was hard to read, but it seemed to say something about a forbidden path. The group gathered around the sign, trying to make out the words. "Should we check it out?" Jack asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Absolutely not," Mia said quickly. She didn't want to take any risks, but the others were curious. After some debate, they decided to stick to the main trail, much to Mia's relief. As they continued, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew taller and thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. Shadows danced on the ground, and the path became harder to follow. Then they started hearing faint whispers. At first they thought it was the wind, but the sound was too steady and soft. It seemed to come from all around them. "Do you hear that?" Sam asked, stopping in his tracks. The others nodded, their faces growing serious. "It's probably just the wind," Jack said, trying to sound confident, but even he looked uneasy. The wind had certainly rustled the trees, and the trees were moving, but Jack remained silent. They decided to keep moving, hoping to leave the strange whispers behind, but the further they walked, the louder the whispers seemed to get. Emma, who had been quiet for most of the hike, suddenly stopped. "Wait," she said, looking around. "Where's Lily?" The group froze. They looked around, calling her name, but there was no answer. "She was right behind me a minute ago," Sam said, his voice shaking. They backtracked along the trail, shouting for her, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Panic set in. Mia wanted to turn back and leave the forest, but Jack insisted they couldn't leave without finding Lily. They decided to split up and search the area. Each person took a flashlight and promised to stay close enough to call for help if needed. But as they spread out, the forest seemed to grow even darker and more confusing. The whispers grew louder, and strange shapes seemed to move just beyond the edge of their vision. Mia began to cry, and Jack tied her arms around her, trying to comfort her with words and confusion. One by one, the group members began to disappear. First, Sam didn't return when they called for him. Then Emma was gone too. Mia and Jack were the only ones left. By now, Mia was terrified and begging Jack to leave, but Jack was determined to find their friends. "We can't just leave them here," he said firmly. Reluctantly, Mia followed him deeper into the forest. As they walked, Jack started acting strangely. He seemed distracted, staring off into the trees as if he could see something Mia couldn't. He stopped responding to her questions and began muttering under his breath. "Jack, what's wrong?" Mia asked, grabbing his arm. But he pulled away, his eyes wide and unfocused. Before Mia could stop him, he walked off the trail and disappeared into the trees. Now completely alone, Mia was filled with fear. She tried to retrace her steps, but quickly realized she was lost. The forest seemed like a maze, with no clear path back to where they had started. The whispers were louder than ever, and shadows moved all around her. She felt like something was watching her, following her every move. After hours of wandering, Mia stumbled out of the forest and onto a road. A passing car stopped to help her, and she told the driver everything that had happened. The driver took her to the local authorities, but when a search team went back to the forest, they found no trace of her friends. The old tree, the strange sign, and even the trail itself seemed to have vanished. After a short time, she found her way to the village and witnessed the same tremendous terrorism while still wearing the same clothes she had worn the day before. After hours of wandering, the old tree started to unravel itself, and she found no trace of her friends. The old tree started to unravel itself, and she found no trace of her friends. The old tree started to unravel itself, and she found no trace of her friends. The old tree, the strange sign, and even the trail where the rabble had been hanging out when they first arrived were all gone. To this day, Mia is the only one who knows what happened in the woods. She tells her story to warn others about the dangers of the mountain, but most people don't believe her. They think it's just a spooky tale meant to scare hikers. But Mia knows the truth. Something strange and terrifying lives in those woods, and it's still out there, waiting for its next visitors. Spider says that's how he feels, and that's why he tells stories at night, not daytime. Spider says that's why the haunted doll. When Emma's grandmother passed away, it was a hard time for everyone in the family. Grandma Jane had been the heart of their gatherings, always telling stories, baking cookies, and knitting scarves for everyone. She lived a long and beautiful life, but her absence left a deep hole in their hearts. After the funeral, the family began sorting through Grandma Jane's belongings. Most of her things were donated or shared among the family, but there was one thing that stood out to Emma: an antique doll. It was stored in a dusty wooden box, tucked away in a corner of Grandma's attic. The doll was beautiful but eerie. It had porcelain skin, shiny black hair tied with a red ribbon, and eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. The dress was old-fashioned, white with tiny lace details. Emma wasn't particularly fond of dolls, but something about this one felt special. Her mom explained that Grandma Jane had always treasured the doll, claiming it had been in the family for generations. "You should keep it, Emma," her mom said. "Grandma would have wanted you to have it." Emma hesitated, but eventually agreed. It felt wrong to leave behind something Grandma had loved so much. She carefully carried the box home and placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom. A strange start. At first, Emma barely paid attention to the doll. Life was busy, and she was still adjusting to the idea of Grandma being gone. But after a few days, little things began to happen. She would come home from work and find the doll's head turned slightly, as if it had been watching the door. Once, she was sure she had left the doll's hands folded neatly, but now one arm hung loosely by its side. "I must have bumped it or something," she thought, brushing off her unease. A week later, Emma started hearing faint noises at night. It sounded like soft tapping or the creak of floorboards, but every time she got up to check, nothing was there. Her cat Milo also began acting strangely. He used to love sleeping in her room, but now he avoided it altogether. If she carried him in, he would hiss and dart out immediately. A little while later, she saw a man standing by the window, listening expectantly at the door. If she carried him in, he would hiss and dart out immediately. Maybe he's just being weird, Emma told herself, though deep down she felt unsettled. That night, she fell asleep early and dreamed her way through the night. The growing fear. One evening, Emma decided to clean her room. She picked up the doll and wiped off the dust that had settled on its face and dress. As she cleaned, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Tiny scratches around the edges of the doll's eyes, almost as if they had been trying to open wider. "That's odd," she muttered, putting it back on the shelf. She couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's expression looked different. It seemed smug, almost like it was amused. That night, the tapping noises grew louder. Emma woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something falling. Her heart raced as she turned on the light. The doll, which had been on the shelf, was now lying face down on the floor. The wooden box it came in was open, even though she was sure she had closed it tightly. "Maybe there's a draft," she whispered, though her hands trembled as she picked the doll up and placed it back on the shelf. Seeking answers. By now, Emma couldn't ignore that something was wrong. She decided to do some research about the doll. She went online and searched for information about antique dolls, hoping to find out more about its history. After a few hours of reading, she stumbled across stories of haunted dolls. The idea seemed ridiculous, but the descriptions felt eerily similar to what she was experiencing. She decided to call her Aunt Margaret, who was the family historian. If anyone knew about the doll's past, it would be her. "That doll?" Aunt Margaret said over the phone. "Your great-great-grandmother brought it from Europe. There's a story that it belonged to a little girl who died young. Some say the girl's spirit stayed with the doll, but those are just old tales. Why do you ask?" Emma's stomach twisted. She didn't believe in ghosts, but the coincidences were becoming too much to ignore. Things get worse. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Emma would wake up to find items in her room moved around. Picture frames were tilted, her books were scattered, and once, she found her bedroom door wide open even though she had locked it. The doll seemed to take on a life of its own. Its position on the shelf would change daily, and Emma swore its eyes grew darker, almost as if they were alive. One night, Emma woke up to the sound of soft whispering. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a child's voice. Shaking with fear, she turned on every light in her room. The whispering stopped, but the doll's head was now turned directly toward her bed. End of section 14. Recorded by Tyler. She decided enough was enough. Getting help. Emma reached out to her friend Lily, who was a firm believer in the supernatural. When Lily heard the story, she didn't laugh or dismiss it. "You need to get rid of that doll," Lily said. "But you can't just throw it away. If it's haunted, it could come back, or make things worse. Let's take it to someone who knows how to deal with these things." "Huh?" The next day, they visited a local psychic named Madame Rosa. The moment Madame Rosa saw the doll, she gasped. "This is no ordinary doll," she said. "There is a spirit attached to it, and it's not a happy one." Emma's hands shook as Madame Rosa explained that the spirit might be seeking attention or trying to communicate. "You have two choices," Madame Rosa said. "You can perform a cleansing ritual to free the spirit, or you can return the doll to where it came from and leave it there." The final decision. Emma decided to try the cleansing ritual. Madame Rosa gave her instructions and a set of tools, candles, herbs, and a written prayer. That night, Emma and Lily performed the ritual in her room. As they chanted the prayer, the room grew colder, and the candles flickered wildly. At one point, the doll seemed to move slightly, but Emma kept going, determined to finish. But when the ritual ended, the room felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The doll's eyes looked dull, no longer filled with that unsettling glint. And Milo decided to place the doll back in its wooden box and store it in the attic. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away, but she didn't want it in her room anymore. Over time, the strange occurrences stopped, and Milo returned to sleeping in her room. Though she never forgot the experience, Emma felt at peace knowing the doll was no longer a threat. It became a story she shared cautiously, warning others to be careful with things they didn't understand. But when she employed the same strategy in the physical world, she felt peace. Do the laws of physics apply to fairy too? As for the doll, it remained in the attic, sealed away, its secrets buried with it. The shop selling dolls were my protection. The ghost in room 206. It was a chilly evening when a tired traveler named Jack pulled into a small, rundown motel on the edge of a quiet town. The neon sign flickered faintly, spelling out Sunset Inn in patchy, uneven light. Jack had been driving for hours and needed a place to rest. The motel didn't look like much, but it was the only option for miles. Jack entered the lobby, where a middle-aged man with thick glasses sat behind the counter. The man glanced up from his newspaper and gave a half-hearted smile. "Need a room?" the man asked. "Yeah, just for the night," Jack replied, dropping his backpack onto the counter. The man retrieved a key from a small rack behind him and hesitated for a moment before handing it over. "Room 206, he said, his voice low. "Top of the stairs, end of the hall." As Jack took the key, he noticed the man's uneasy expression. "Everything okay?" Jack asked. The man shrugged. It's fine. Just some folks say that room, it's got a history. Nothing to worry about, though. Jack raised an eyebrow. A history? The man waved his hand dismissively. Old stories. People like to talk. You'll be fine. If this creep shows up tomorrow and nothing has happened, no one will know. Jack chuckled. Well, I'm too tired to care about ghost stories tonight. Thanks. He grabbed his key and headed for the stairs. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. Jack found room 265 at the very end. The door creaked loudly as he unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was small and plain, with a single bed, a nightstand, and an old TV that buzzed faintly when he turned it on. He thought of how he had walked by it on his way up the stairs, so while he was watching his brother read the description, Jack tossed his backpack onto the chair and flopped onto the bed. The mattress was lumpy, and the sheets smelled faintly of bleach, but it was good enough for one night. He closed his eyes, hoping for a few hours of rest. But as soon as he began to drift off, strange things started happening. At first, it was just small noises, a faint creak of the floorboards, the soft sound of something tapping against the window. Jack tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the wind or the old building settling. Then, the TV flickered. Jack opened his eyes to see static on the screen, even though he hadn't changed the channel. He grabbed the remote and turned the TV off, but the uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. Suddenly, the door opened and Dorian reached out to get his remote, squeezing the trigger as he did so, telling the cameraman to keep filming. Moments later, he heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that he thought he might be imagining it, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Get out! It hurt my eyes," the voice was calling, and then the room was silent. "Get out!" he cried out to the voice again, and this time he was able to make out two. Jack sat up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. No one answered. The room was silent again, but the air felt heavier now, as if something unseen was watching him. The door rattled and moved when he opened it once more, but when he laid his ear against the door, nothing came out. He rattled it louder, as if someone was watching him, but the air felt heavier now, as if something unseen was watching him. Jack tried to shake it off. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, lying back down. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt that same strange presence, like someone was standing right beside him. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Jack shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around him. That's when he saw it. A faint figure in the corner of the room. It was barely visible, more like a shadow than a person, but its outline was clear enough to make Jack's blood run cold. He froze, unable to move or speak. The shadow seemed to drift closer, and as it did, Jack could make out more details. It was the figure of a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She wore an old-fashioned dress, torn and stained, and her expression was one of sorrow and anger. The woman opened the door of a narrow tunnel and called out to Jack. "Come in," she cried out. "Who are you?" Jack managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The ghost didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the door. Jack felt a wave of coldness wash over him, followed by an overwhelming urge to leave the room. He jumped out of bed, grabbed his backpack, and bolted for the door. As he reached the hallway, he glanced back and saw the ghost standing by the window, watching him. Her lips moved silently, but Jack didn't stay to figure out what she was saying. This time, back in the lobby, Jack found the man at the counter still reading his newspaper. "What the hell is wrong with room 206? Jack demanded, his voice loud enough to startle the man. The man sighed and set down his newspaper. "I told you. That room has a history. Some say it's haunted by a woman who stayed there years ago. She was found dead in the room under unusual circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Jack pressed. The man hesitated. Well, they say she was murdered. The case was never solved, and some people think her spirit never left. Guests who stay in that room often report strange things, voices, shadows, cold spots. Some even claim to have seen her. Jack ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Why do you even rent out that room? The man shrugged. Not everyone believes in ghosts. Most people stay the night and don't notice a thing. But you saw her, didn't you? I saw her, I acknowledged. You saw only what you wanted to see and what you easily recognized as reality. Did she really? Jack nodded slowly. Yeah, I saw her. The man gave him a sympathetic look. If you want, you can switch rooms, or I can refund your money and you can find somewhere else to stay. Jack thought about it for a moment. He was exhausted and didn't feel like driving any further tonight. I'll take another room, he said finally. Bullet reluctantly said no. The man handed him a new key. Room 104. It's on the first floor. No ghosts down there, as far as I know. The man handed him a new key and opened the front door for him to escape. The man sat down on a stranger in the middle of the road / diner when the key went on. Jack managed a weak smile. Thanks. He spent the rest of the night in room 104, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind made him jump. He couldn't shake the image of the ghostly woman in room 206, her hollow eyes and sorrowful expression haunting his thoughts. The next morning, Jack checked out of the motel as soon as the sun came up. As he got back on the road, he couldn't help but glance back at the old building. The memory of that night would stay with him forever. A chilling reminder that some places hold more than just history. They hold the lingering echoes of the past, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. The call from the dead. It was a quiet evening when John first heard the phone ring. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ever since his wife Emily had passed away, life had felt empty. The once lively home now echoed with silence. John, lost in his thoughts, was startled when the phone rang sharply, cutting through the stillness. He walked over and picked it up without thinking much of it. Hello, he said, his voice tired and heavy. There was no response at first, just static, faint and eerie. Then, a voice came through, soft and familiar. I started moving the controls toward the voice again, but there was no response, and I stopped. John, the voice said. John froze. His heart raced, and his grip on the phone tightened. It was Emily's voice. He knew that voice better than his own. Loosening his grasp on the collar of his overalls, he went in. Who is this? He asked, his voice trembling. And finally, that's what they said. Who is this? And it made sense, for in the past I had looked at the photo of my grandmother. It's me, the voice replied, barely above a whisper. It's Emily. Slow down. She's coming. John's legs felt weak, and he sat down on the nearest chair. This isn't funny, he said, anger and confusion mixing in his tone. Who is this? How dare you? But the voice didn't change. It had the same warmth, the same gentle tone Emily always had when she spoke to him. John, it's really me, she insisted. I don't have much time. Please, listen to me. John's mind raced. This had to be some sort of prank. Someone was using a recording or imitating her voice. But how did they know the little things? The way she said his name, the slight lilt in her tone that only he would recognize. He couldn't make sense of it. This is impossible, he muttered. Emily is... You're... gone. I know, the voice replied, but I've found a way to reach you. Please, John, you have to believe me. You're in danger. Danger is not enough, Todd said, voice rising with fury. Danger? What danger? John's confusion deepened. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice barely steady. There's someone watching you, she said. A man. He's dangerous. You have to be careful. John glanced around the room as if expecting to see someone there. The windows were closed, the doors locked. He felt a chill run down his spine. "Who? What man?" he asked. But the line went dead. The silence on the other end was deafening. John sat there, holding the phone, unsure of what to do. It was just 10 p.m. on a Tuesday morning. The next day, John tried to convince himself it had been a dream or a cruel joke. Maybe grief was playing tricks on his mind. He hadn't been sleeping well since Emily's death, and stress could do strange things. He decided to forget about it and go about his day, an attempt to just forget about it instead. But that evening, the phone rang again, and again, it was her voice. Neither my spouse, my sisters, nor my grandmother had ever heard her voice like that before. "John, you have to listen to me," she said urgently. "This isn't real," he replied, his voice shaking. "You're not real." "I wish I wasn't," she said softly, "but I am. And you're in danger. The man... he's getting closer." John's mind was spinning. Could this really be Emily? Could she somehow be reaching out from beyond? Or was he losing his mind? And this time, there was no paralysis, no need for medications, or the usual care and support that come with this. His brain went to shit, which is not a general thing for me. "Who is he? What does he want?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted, "but he's dangerous. You have to trust me. Be careful where you go. Don't let him get too close." "Where is he now?" John asked, his voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "He's outside." John's blood ran cold. He jumped up and ran to the window, pulling back the curtain. The street was dark and empty, the faint glow of a street lamp casting long shadows. There was no one there. "I don't see anyone," he said. "He's there," she insisted. "He's watching. Please, John, you have to believe me." "It belongs there." The calls continued over the next few days. Each time, Emily's warnings grew more urgent. She told him the man was getting closer, that he needed to stay alert. John started to feel like he was losing his grip on reality. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see the mysterious figure Emily spoke of. And then, one night, he saw him. It was late, and John was sitting by the window, unable to sleep. The street outside was quiet, as it usually was at that hour. But then, he saw a shadow move. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then the figure stepped into the light of the street lamp. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and hat. He stood perfectly still, staring at John's house. He looked so real that John started creeped out by the sense of someone watching him. He walked over and opened the door. The man stood up straighter, staring at John's house. John's heart pounded in his chest. He drew the curtains and turned off the lights, hoping the man hadn't seen him. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police. "There's a man outside my house," he told him. Then stopped. "What is he doing?" the dispatcher asked. "He's just standing there," John replied. "He's been watching my house." The dispatcher assured him that an officer would be sent to check it out, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one of the officers asked. John nodded. "He was there. I swear he was there." The officers did a quick search of the area but found nothing. They told John to call them if he saw anything else, and left. The next call from Emily came later that night. "He's closer now," she said. "I saw him," John replied, his voice shaking. "Then you know I'm telling the truth," she said, pointing to the drops of sweat clinging to him. John didn't know what to believe anymore. All he knew is that he was terrified. As the days went on, the man continued to appear. Sometimes he would stand in the same spot, watching the house. Other times, John would catch glimpses of him out of the corner of his eye. Each time, the sighting was accompanied by another call from Emily. 11 days later, March 15th, 2011, the sighting was accompanied by another call from Emily. "He's getting closer," she would say. "Please, John, you have to be careful." She didn't. John started to feel like a prisoner in his own home. He barely left the house, afraid of running into the man. He kept all the doors and windows locked. double-checking them multiple times a day. One night, the phone rang again. This time, Emily's voice was different. It was filled with fear. "John, he's inside," she said. John froze. "What do you mean he's inside?" he whispered. "He's in the house," she said. "You have to get out, now." John's heart pounded as he grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife. He moved through the house slowly, checking every room, but there was no sign of anyone, and nor was there anyone still around. It was late in the afternoon when he heard a young girl cry for help. "There's no one here," he said into the phone. But Emily didn't respond. The line was dead. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Standing at the end of the hallway was the man. He wore a crew-cut sweatshirt. His pants were splattered with dirt and grime, and a dirty jeans hanging loose. John's breath caught in his throat. The man didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at John with cold, empty eyes. "Who are you?" John demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward. John's instincts kicked in and he ran. He bolted out of the house and into the night, not stopping until he was several blocks away. He called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. John knew he couldn't keep living like this. He needed answers. Who was this man? Why was he being targeted? And how was Emily able to call him? He began digging into Emily's past, looking for any clues. He discovered things he had never known about her, secrets she had kept hidden. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. The man was connected to Emily somehow, and now he was after John. As the days went on, the calls from Emily became less frequent, and the man's appearances grew more sporadic. But the fear never left John. He knew he couldn't rest until he found the truth. And so, armed with nothing but determination and the memory of his wife's voice, John set out to uncover the mystery of the calls from the dead.